Good morning, crime community. I'm here to continue to read out about Edgar Allan Poe. This is called Poe's Elitism and the Stylus. It has become, on very slender evidence, an accepted assumption of Poe scholarship that Poe's primary aim as a journalist was to reach the mass audience, and quite often it seemed to be assumed that he was successful in doing so and was a popular writer. However, Munford Jones wrote in 1944 that what Poe was principally trying to do was, like O. Henry and Ring Lardner, to master a market. His originality consisted of doing better than anybody else what everybody else was trying to do. His famous critical theories are, to a surprising degree, the rationale of successful magazine writing of his day. J.B. Hubbell in 1956 incorporated this statement into his standard biographical essay on Poe. The volume on Poe, published in 1961 in the Twain's American Authors series, maintains, without producing evidence, that Poe was intimately in touch with the mass market and that his stories were successful. The foundations for such views were laid by a number of scholars, notably Napier, Wilt, and F.L. Pate and H.S. Canby in the 1920s and 30s. Canby attempted to show that Poe was a forerunner of modern American mass journalists, quoted passages from the Hawthorne Review of 1847, which I discussed above, since Poe in that review condemns any writer who cannot master the mass audience. Can be assumed that he must himself have been successful in that purpose, and others may have assumed that this after him, but I think we have seen that Poe's statements of intention cannot be isolated in this way. They must be fitted into the context of his total socio-literary attitudes. I have shown that he was not by no means successful. What is more, some views of his journalism more or less ignore the consistently elite journalistic ideal that he maintained throughout his career in connection with the plans of his own magazine. Divided Aims, 1845 to 1849. In momentary fits of optimism brought about by the successes of the autography series and the facts of the case of M. Valdemar, Poe articulated the idea of himself as a conspiratorial mass journalist. A contemporary account of 3 successive visits to Poe's home in 1846 provides an illustration in miniature of the mechanics of the alternating attitudes. When Mrs. Gary Grove Nichols visited Poe at Fordham, he was read with quite exultation to his visitors Elizabeth Barrett's letters describing the success of Valdemar in London. On her second visit, he had said, "Fame forms no motive power with me. What I can care for the judgment of a multitude, every individual of which I despise," and had the expressed criticism of the journalistic conspiracy to manufacture opinions in which his poverty inevitably involved him. Or his third visit, however, he contradicted himself, saying, "I love fame. I dote on it. I idolize it. I would drink to the very dregs of glorious intoxication. No man lives unless he is famous. How bitterly I believed my nature and my aspirations when I said I did not desire fame, that I despised it." Mrs. Nichols, despite Poe's denial of his earlier assertion, felt that the utterances of both occasions might be true to the mood that suggested them. It is noteworthy that in both moods, fame is equated from approval from a multitude, every individual of which I despise, and is to be enjoyed contemporaneously. No man lives unless he is famous. What Poe is discussing here is not future fame, but what we are calling popularity. It is easy to see how his vacillation between ambition and the scorn of it led him into seeing himself at times as a successful mass journalist, and in the same way he saw himself as a successful detective, Dupin, and as an unsolving the universe of Eureka. The idea of himself was partially a compensatory fantasy image, but it was its polar opposite, the intensely held view of himself as an elitist artist, and it could appear that its disappearance momentarily in obedience to the even faintest encouragement, but the main body of Poe's work was very unlikely to be assimilated by the public its various variations in tones, its proliferation of kind and superiority of attitude were completely inconsistent with the growing homogenization of material, the repetition of the few simplest escape patterns which increasingly characterize Poe's mass journalism. And Poe had not, as we have seen, the temperament to remain consistent in his self-explanation in the face of apparent failure. We have to take into account, too, in his final few years, professional insecurity, physical and mental ill health, and the disturbing effect on him of his wife's illness and death. It is hardly surprising that Poe's literary attitudes in these final years are characterized by wild and inconsistent attempts to convince people and himself of his complete mental control over the course of his career. Occasionally, he does not seem to have placed his hopes in book publications of his tales and gradual accretion of orthodox literary fame. In August 1846, he told P.P. Cook, "In writing these tales one by one at long intervals, I have kept the book unity always in mind. That is, each has been composed with reference to the effect as part of a whole. Either this statement involves a falsification of his past intentions, or else it represents an overall strategy which, because of his failure to have the Tales of Folio Club published, and because of the small sales of Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque, he has kept to himself. Certainly his words to Professor Charles Afton in 1844 are far more representative of his expressions of intention throughout his career. Holding steadily in view of my ultimate purpose to found a magazine of my own, or in which at least I have a propriety right, and have been in constant endeavor in the meantime not so much to establish a reputation great in itself as one of the particular character which could be best furthered by my special objects. Thus I have been written no books, and have been so far essentially a magazinist." What he was now saying to Cook about his book publication may explain one aspect of his activities in 1846 on. It illuminates in particular his preparation of Eureka outside the magazine convention of lecture and book, to advise the correspondents to ignore the Godet's Literati series and wait for a book which he was at body and soul, and which would be true. And Poe made few statements about as though thoroughly and consistently backed by his expressed views throughout his career in the 1844 assertion that was ultimate purpose had been found, a magazine of his own, a main desire to establish a journalistic reputation which would be consistent with that purpose. To be controlled is to be ruined. One of the most important assumptions of the mass publication situation was the one that businessmen, rather than writers, should be arbitrators of the literary situation. J.K. Paulding explained mildly in his letters to T.W. White about Poe's book that he, as a man of letters, had no influence over Harper Brothers, the publishers, and indeed ought to have none, for my taste does not exactly conform to that of the public at present. But Poe never accepted this. He will have been noticed that in neither of his predominant literary moods did he ever conceive himself of anything other than infinitely superior to the mass audience. And in his professional role, he was shared with the British journalists of the previous generation a sense of the gentlemanly tradition which set him above his employers. Coleridge, De Quincey, Wilson, and Bulwer had each felt that the matter, rather than the proprietors of the magazine, should be the arbitrator of its quality. The fact that the Blackwood made him editor only a name and allowed him not actual freedom of responsibility in regard to the magazine's contents rankled very deeply with Wilson. De Quincey's tiffs with Blackwood had the same source as Bulwer's strained relation with Colquhoun and his more practical editorial associate Samuel Carter Hall. A sense of superior right to judgment and a similar sense of superiority was one element in Poe's difficult relationship with American magazine proprietors like White and Burton. T.W. White recorded how he was cramped by Poe. "In the exercise of my own judgment as to what articles I shall or shall not admit into my work, it is true that I neither have his sagacity or nor his learning, but I do believe I know a handspike from a saw. To Burton, his next employer, Poe wrote aggrievedly that I did not do 4 times as much as I did for the magazine was your own fault. I first wrote long articles which you deemed inadmissible, and I did not suggest any of which you had not some immediate and decided objection. G.R. Graham found a more cooperative attitude in Poe's than did his predecessors, but this was clearly to some extent the result of his own tolerance as well as Poe's adaptation in the relationship which Poe describes between the villainous fat editor and proprietor and the property-stricken young author he exploits to death in the magazine Prison House. He expresses semi-fictionally the same frustrations explained bitterly to F.W. Thomas. To coin one's brain into silver at the nod of a master is, to be my thinking, the hardest task in the world. And there can be little doubt that this inherited discontent and literary servitude was related to his sense and inadequate recognition and reinforced by his critical distaste for the mass circulation journals he served. One reason for his discontent was Burton's Gentleman's Magazine, was its prize list and the other humbug, and he claimed to have resigned from Graham's out of disgust with his namby-pamby character of the magazine, a character which was impossible to eradicate. I allude to the contemptible pictures, fashion plates, music, and love tales. He said that he thought too little of the successful Literate series in Godey's to guard successfully against haste and accuracy and prejudice. In fact, his general attitude in those aspects of the magazine of this day which allow them with Godey's consistently bears out his implication of the contemptuous phrase, the Godey's, the Snowdens, and id genius omne in the letters to Lowell in 1844. Poe's discontent with the channels of mass circulation and the mass audience kept alive in his impractical idea of an elite magazine which could rescue him and the other writers of the country from his servitude. He was suggesting in this letter that the elite of the men of letters could combine secretly to produce a magazine which in every other respect of his own imagined Stylus, and thus defend themselves from the mass circulation publishers. The feeling and endeavor of which Poe acted on this conviction that to be controlled is to be ruined, wherein so intense that he could claim the magazine's project to be the grand purpose of my life, which I have never swerved for a moment, and this when he was not the remotest chance of achieving it. As he told Charles Anton in 1844, that before leaving the Southern Literary Messenger, he had realized the brilliant field for ambition which a magazine of bold and noble aims presented, and that from them, on his ultimate purpose, had been found a magazine of my own, or in which at least I might have a proprietary right. But Poe's hopeless attachment to the project would be additional evidence, as if were needed, that he found no real satisfaction in the mass circulation channels of publication, which offered him some economic security. His lack of faith in American highbrow journals which published his work, such as the Democratic Review and the American Review, probably reflected his awareness of the economic instability. His description of the Democratic Review in 1844 as, apart from its politics, the most valuable journal of the day, must be flanked by his complaint in 1849 that it and the Whig Review have been forced to stop paying for contributions, and that the Southern Literary Messenger, which owed him a great deal, cannot pay just yet, so that he was reduced to Sartain and Graham. The Broadway Journal was the only magazine that Poe ever actually controlled. It was far from the $5 monthly he always envisioned, being a weekly journal with a precarious circulation of under 1,000, but Poe's emotional investment in it was considerable, since he had never before been even this close to his life's ambition. The editorial conduct of the Broadway Journal was under the sole charge of Edgar A. Poe, said the first number of the second volume of the Broadway Journal, and Edgar A. Poe, editor and proprietor, but the journal did not prosper. Lack of capital was probably the main reason, but one cannot discount as another factor Poe's ruthless use of what had been a fairly popular paper as a vehicle in which he reprint so much of his own fairly highbrow work. In less than a year, the Broadway Journal carried 42 of the tales of the other 20 poems, as well as many reviews and general articles. Poe's self-sustaining tone when it folded is significant. Unexpected engagements demanding my whole attention and the objects being fulfilled so far as regards my personally for which the Broadway Journal was established, I now, as its editor, bid farewell as cordially to foes as to friends. The B Journal, he wrote grandiloquently to Mrs. Hale, has fulfilled its destiny, which was a matter of no great moment. I have never regarded it as more than a temporary adjunct to other designs. I am now busy making arrangements for the establishment of a magazine which offers a wild field of literary ambition. Professor Chaz Anthon had agreed to take charge for me in the Department of Criticism on Scholastic Letters. His name will be announced. I shall have also a Berlin and a Parisian correspondent, both of eminence. Mrs. Weiss's article, The Last Day of Edgar A. Poe, shows Poe as latterly obsessed with the dream magazine of J.W. Ostrom, calls the Stylus, and his letters confirm that this project became a central endeavor of Poe's life after his collapse of the Broadway Journal. After one has allowed his unbalanced mental state in these last years, one can still see a thread of opportunist logic in his dedication. Despite his attempts to adapt many of his qualities of Poe's later work, its variations on learned journalism, burlesque, prose poetry, authoritarian criticism, and metaphysical inquiry, its controversial stridency, bitterness, and superiority, its variety of tone and fecundity of original forms, continued the tendency of his early work, and presupposed an elite audience for their appreciation. The Stylus represented the last hope of an alternative to the mass journals, by which he could gain recognition and wider currency of his superior work. He told Evelyn lamely in June 1849 that he was going to Richmond to see about the Stylus, but that he was awaiting the best opportunity for its issue. And if by waiting until the day of judgment I perceived still increasing chances of ultimate success, while until the day of judgment I will patiently wait. It was on this day that he died. That's going to leave the reading for today, which will go into The Lost Elite, Poe's Ideal Magazine, and then the conclusion of Poe and the British magazine tradition. So if there's any like and truth to what I'm saying here, please like and subscribe and share. And I'm going to show to all the Metallica fans out there, to all the vinyl community, I got a little sticker here that you might like looking at. Is that a pretty cool sticker for all the Metallica fans? I think it is. So enjoy and have a nice day, and God bless the families and children.